I'm Craig Bennett. I'm the Chief Executive of the Wildlife Trust, and I'm delighted to be joined by wildlife presenter and filmmaker Gordon Buchanan, who joins us from Glasgow via Zoom. Gordon, great to see you.
Thank you very much.
Now, Gordon, we're going to be talking about all things nature, nature in the UK and much further afield as well. But let's start by mentioning your tour, 30 Years in the Wild, the anniversary tour 2023. It starts next week in Dundee on the 14th of March and runs through to April. You're going all over the country, lots and lots of different towns and cities, everywhere from Brighton to Reading to Leeds, to London, to Bath, to Birmingham, and many others in between as well. You're covering a lot of ground.
I made a mistake in an interview sort of the other week. I said, I don't think there's sort of a single property, certainly in England, that's no longer than an hour away from one of the venues. And then somebody got in touch and said, well, our house is an hour and 20 minutes away. But yeah, it's a good spread. I mean, it's really the audience, the people that watch wildlife documentaries that come along. So it's kind of, I think it's an opportunity to meet the people that keep me in a job, I suppose.
Just give us a little bit of a flavour of what's in there for people that come to the show.
I think this sort of, and this is something that didn't really occur to me until I started putting the talk together, that a lot of the things that we filmed when at the beginning in the sort of early 90s, these were creatures that had never been filmed before, and animals that had never been photographed before, and creatures that I'd never heard of. And I'm pretty good at, there's not that many species that sort of, especially with mammals that had even the most obscure, that if I saw a photograph that I wouldn't know what it was. But back then to be in the rainforests of West Africa and actually discovering these animals that had never been filmed, it was just sort of, at the time, I suppose I didn't really think of it as being unusual, because it was like, early days of exploration. You go to a place and you're seeing new interesting things. But I think looking back and sort of sharing the stories and pictures and clips, that back then, this is first time ever that we'd filmed West African chimpanzees. Chimpanzees that we filmed, they were using tools. I spoke to a primatologist, somebody that spent a decade or so working with chimpanzees in East Africa. And I said, I've just been filming chimpanzees in West Africa. Sort of, he goes, oh yeah, those ones don't use tools. And I said, they certainly do. And it's never been recorded. I said, well, we've filmed it. And this was sort of, a real first. And then I went to Brazil and spent 2 years in Brazil. And again, that was sort of, uncharted territory for photographers and wildlife filmmakers. None of the animals, I think we were the first people to go to the Amazon and actually sort of set up camp there, literally, and film a lot of these, this sort of abundance of life that's there. So
yeah, well, very famous footage there of those chimpanzees in West Africa. Any of us that have seen that over the years will never forget it for sure. But what about back home here in the UK? I mean, as you're traveling around the UK with this tour, are there any particular species you might hope to see? I mean, what are your favorite UK nature encounters and your favorite UK based species?
One thing I'm often asked is sort of what's my sort of top wildlife encounter or favorite wildlife encounter, and I sort of tend not to have favorites, because I think especially with species, it's so wrapped up in the landscape in which they live. A project is wrapped up in the weather or how successful that might be, and also it's sort of the people that you're with. So I've had some trips to film wolves, and it's been disastrous because we haven't managed to get close enough to them. And I've had an amazing trip where everything comes together. But I think in the UK, growing up on the West Coast and having whales and dolphins, basking sharks, golden eagles, sea eagles, these are sort of world-beating wild animals that that are right on my doorstep. When I'm on tour, I think with this sort of traveling from town to town, I probably won't have that much. Optimistically, I'm going to take my binoculars and take my camera and try to find the time to get out into sort of wild places and sort of reserves that there are.
We'd love to welcome you to a Wildlife Trust reserve while you're on
that'd be
tour,
great.
Gordon, for sure. And we've got many of them. But tell us a little bit more about your childhood then. You know, was a 10-year-old Gordon dreaming about doing the sort of work you're doing now?
Yes and no. I mean, I spent all of my time at school daydreaming, and I was all my daydreams were about being outside, sort of what I was going to do after school, what I was going to do at the weekend, what we were going to do in the summer holidays, you know. So I suppose I was sort of just, it was just all about being outdoors. It was all about just sort of, you know, kind of partly in school. I found it's really struggled to focus. And yeah, I just sort of always felt every moment I was in school as I'd much rather have been outside. And I didn't realize that, you know, I could find a career that would enable me to sort of spend most of the last 30 years outside and not sitting behind a desk. So yeah, and it was just at the point when I was 17, when I was 16, I met a wildlife cameraman that was based on the Isle of Mull, and I just thought that just sounded like the best job in the world. So I kind of spoke to him, and as I got to know him and helped him out, I was really just wanted sort of advice and sort of pointers on sort of what, you know, how I could go about, if I could go about getting into his line of work. And then when I was 17, he needed an assistant for a contracted job in Sierra Leone, and he offered the job to me. And there was lots of 100 or so graduates, people that studied zoology or media, people that had sort of traveled extensively. I'd never been anywhere, I'd never been abroad, never been in a plane. So he offered me the job, which at the time I wasn't really puzzled by. I was just so excited about this opportunity that he'd given me. And over the years, I was, why the hell did he give a 17-year-old schoolboy that sort of wasn't worldly wise that opportunity? And I think it was just the fact that if you're going to spend a year and a half on an uninhabited island with somebody, you've got to make sure that you can get along with them. So I think he knew that. He knew that sort of what my qualifications were, well, non-existent, and he just wanted somebody he could get along with and shape into the assistant that he wanted them to be.
And how did you make the transition from assistant to being cameraman then?
I mean, it's true today that it's sort of photography and filmmaking. It's still quite an expensive business, but you can buy fairly cheap equipment that does the job. But back then we were shooting on film. You know, to buy a film camera, to buy a single roll of film was horrendously expensive. So I managed to, the one thing, it was a great sort of apprenticeship, but I wasn't paid much at all. So although I was spending all my time abroad, I didn't end up sort of after 4 years with a big pot of cash. So I had to get a loan from the bank, and the Scottish Prince of Youth Business Trust, they had loans for young people wanting to set up businesses. So I sort of scraped together all the money that I could and then bought my first camera. And then after 2 years, I was just getting such little work that I thought, I'm going to have to give this up because I couldn't pay the loan back. And then fortunately I got offered a contract for a year, which kind of took the pressure off.
So what's the advice you'd give to a young person starting out in this line of work now? I mean, a few things have changed, I guess. What advice would you give?
I think a lot of young people, if you want to make wildlife programs or documentaries of any sort, there's nothing really stopping you. You can go out and you can tell stories. You know, most people have a phone, and most phones have got really impressive cameras on them. Most phones have got little editing systems. I mean, the world is full of filmmakers. If you look at TikTok and Instagram, those are people making little sort of 30-second, minute and a half films. So I think if you want to do it, you should already be out there doing it with the equipment that you've got. But yeah, I think sort of that having the passion and the interest to sort of, and the commitment to go out to a place and sort of, you know, do it your own. That's sort of, I think that's a prerequisite, because it's so much easier now than it ever has been.
Now, obviously, with your wildlife photography, with these amazing cameras and so on, you're able to capture those kind of beautiful images. But sadly, the evidence is clear, say in the UK, that since the 1970s, more than 40% of species have declined in abundance. 26% of mammals at risk of disappearing altogether here in the UK. Do you feel that decline has been visible here in the UK? Have you felt that, and how does it compare to abroad?
Yeah, I definitely have. And when you kind of read about it, you hear the stats and figures, and sort of you're aware of the level of loss. But just last summer, I was back on Mull for a few days, and I had sort of an afternoon on my own. It was a really one of those really blisteringly hot summer's days. And on those days when we were kids, we used to go up this river to an area where there was a pool that you could swim in, and there was no swimming pool but on Mull back then. So if you wanted to swim, you either go in the sea or find one of the rivers. And I thought, I'm going to go up the it's called the Black Pool. I'm going to go up to the Black Pool. And as I was walking through, the path was all overgrown, like sort of kids haven't been up there, but I sort of followed this same trail that I would walk on 30 years ago. And one thing that I remember on that walk, insects everywhere, particularly grasshoppers, sort of on those hot days, grasshoppers chirping. And that was the sound of that sort of mile-long walk. And I walked back up, and a lot of the trees were very mature, but it was dead. The sort of bird song, the insect sound just wasn't there. And I went to the pool, and ordinarily you'd sit there for 5 minutes and there would be dragonflies buzzing about and life on this sort of pond skaters on the river, and it was barren. There was nothing there. And I spent about an hour, and there was you didn't see any fish sort of leaping in the water. There was no insect sound to really speak of, no dragonflies. And I realized that one river in 30 across 30 years had been sort of stripped of all life. In the bay in Tobermory, when I was a kid, there's an island, and you'd look out, and it was sort of you'd see all of this bird life. So there was terns, there was swans nesting, gull species. And I went out the same trip last year. I went out to the island, and there's nothing nesting there. All of the birds have gone, and that's just a small part. 2 experiences of places that used to be rich and abundance, and there's nothing left.
And it strikes me that we're kind of perhaps getting better at drawing the links between what's happening in the UK and internationally and back again over the last few decades. Seeing a more link between these. I'm struck particularly by the segment you had in the Our Changing Planet series that you did for the BBC, where you highlighted the huge challenges faced by the jaguar population in the Pantanal in the Amazon. 30% of the Pantanal destroyed by wildfires in 2020, in excess of 17 million animals killed through those wildfires, many of which were linked to climate change. And obviously we've seen wildfires across Europe, parts of Europe, and even here in the UK over the last couple of years. So the climate's kind of getting more unpredictable in many respects.
Yeah, well, that kind of started, I think, in the early 1990s, and I was working in Brazil, and that first year is the rainy season. The rains will sort of start. Pretty much, it was there was a week where they would start, and they sort of, as far back as anyone could remember, the rains always arrived, and the river would go up to a certain level, and it would fall through the season. And the first year, it kind of happened, and as predicted. And the second year, the rains were late, and there was a huge drought across the whole Amazon basin, and that just felt a bit of a kind of a blip. But then since then, weather patterns across the world sort of worked a lot in India, here in the UK. The weather is sort of, we've just got used to the sort of the unpredictability of those sort of keystone seasonal changes, that within a winter you'll get X amount of storms. In the summer, you'll get a heat wave, but it's just sort of around the world. There's no predicting now these patterns that sort of were utterly predictable, and it is really depressing to go to somewhere like the Pantanal, a place that I first heard of when I was working in Brazil, and few people. Pantanal's really sort of famous, world famed now, but back then I remember a few people saying, you have to go to this region of Brazil, it's called the Pantanal. It is like the Garden of Eden, and a few people had been there and taken photographs, and I just thought this was the most extraordinary place, because it was not particularly populated. The wildlife that was there sort of did manage to sort of live alongside the people, the way that people used the land. But in that time, yeah, there's been a huge amount of devastation, either from lack of rains, or these wildfires, and you've got a world's biggest wetland system that is slowly drying out and becoming more vulnerable to fire. But then there's sort of those, you always try and look at this sort of the good news stories in tandem with the bad news stories, and sadly the bad news stories all far outweigh the good news. But across the last 30 years, the jaguar, which is one of those almost impossible animals to film, you can go to that part of the Pantanal, and when I was there last year before last, they had a 98.2% of their visitors came for 2 days and saw a jaguar. And I was there back in August last year as a repeat visit for Our Changing Planet. And I said, have your numbers gone up? And he says, 100%. If you come to the Pantanal for 2 days or more, you're guaranteed that you're going to see a jaguar. So this is a species that sort of emerged from the shadows because of I suppose the changing relationship that people have with that animal.
So you particularly looked, didn't you? You particularly looked at the role that safari tours can play there to try and help support a move away from intensive farming and support the local community to be able to making good money from ecotourism.
Yeah, I think there's good ecotourism and there's bad I suppose bad ecotourism isn't ecotourism, but if you can actually have that sort of preservation of wild places and species at the heart of of any practice, whether it's sort of business or whether it's tourism, it's about coexistence. It's not about ring fencing national parks and saying, well, let's sort of leave these animals in there and protect this area. It has to actually go beyond that and sort of working with communities that are prepared to live alongside wild animals.
Gordon, we've been talking about jaguars as a kind of predator in Brazil. What about predators in this country? I mean, Wildlife Trust has been reintroducing pine martens and so on. But of course, in the years ahead, there could be opportunities around reintroducing lynx and even other predators. I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think whatever kind of restores nature's balance is a good thing. Anything that protects species and their habitats and allowing certain species to perform that role in a natural environment, it's kind of we have to do that. We can't just sort of plant trees. We have to kind of try and recreate these habitats, but incorporating people and communities into those landscapes. So pine martens, it's amazing. 30 years ago, I thought I'll probably never see a pine marten. Even the time that I've spent up in the sort of old remnants of Caledonian forest, you would see signs of pine martens. Whereas now, just on the outskirts of Glasgow, literally on the edge of Glasgow, I saw a pine marten run across the wall and jump over the fence into somebody's garden. And before too long, another 10 years, people are going to have pine martens in the city because there's lots of habitat here from them. But when it comes to lynx and the reintroduction of lynx, the habitat can support them. There's prey and there's habitat there for them. If there was a land bridge to Europe or to Norway, these animals would come back because there's an opportunity for them to live here. But as we're an island, we have to give them help and support. And lynx, especially with roe deer numbers, roe deer are kind of one of my favorite deer species, but we have too many of them. And yeah, lynx perform that really important role in the natural environment, that sort of controlling deer numbers, which helps the sort of growth of woodlands and forests, and that helps a whole range of other species. So it's about putting that jigsaw puzzle back together and putting all the really important parts of the puzzle in place. And I think lynx are one of these species. They should be here. There's no reason not to. And I think the kind of conflict that there might be would be minimal and far outweighed by this of the positives of having them here. The interesting thing with lynx is there's very sort of few, in Scotland, there's lots of places that have, otter names or badger names or fox names in Gaelic, whereas there's very little evidence of lynx, because lynx are this creature of the shadows that, even when they were here, even before their numbers started to reduce, the people living here thousands of years ago probably would never have seen them. And if they do return, even if they would, they were at saturation point, they'd still be a very difficult animal to spot. They're not going to be wandering the streets of Glasgow and on every hillside. They're a creature that can only live by, being elusive and hiding itself away. But the positives that they'll make to, the natural environment is sort of, profound.
Yeah, they're fundamentally part of British ecosystems, aren't they? And for as long as they remain absent, our ecosystems are impoverished, really.
Yeah. And we're with red deer as well, we're sort of always having to sort of meddle with nature, either by controlling red deer numbers, by building fences, by planting trees. And with having, if wolves were to return, there's again that sort of role that they play in the natural environment. We don't have to build fences, you don't have to sort of replant woodland. It just it allows sort of nature to repair itself. And that's the thing that I love, that as fragile and vulnerable as nature is, when it's given that helping hand, it is breathtaking, its powers of recovery. What those natural processes can do is, it's unbelievable. There's places where there's never been a single tree planted, but they've controlled the deer numbers, and you just see that life return. The trees start growing, sort of the insects come in, bird species benefits. And I think I think there definitely there's that movement towards repairing the British countryside. I think people get it a lot more. It's about sort of, realizing what we have lost. And I think 10 years ago, people probably never really considered what Britain once looked like, and didn't realize how much we've lost. So I think that's sort of, there's more people on board with that and get that as a concept. This is something that needs to be done.
Now, obviously, some species capture our attention more easily than others. Wolves and lynx are right up there, of course. But do you feel plants can sometimes be overlooked by nature programs, as they're perhaps not seen as glamorous, as exciting as mammals and birds? I mean, just this week we've seen the release of a new plant atlas showing that 53% of native plants have declined here in the UK since the 1950s. How important is it to champion wild plants?
Yeah, I think it is really important. I think those sort of, anything that doesn't grab the sort of main spot in wildlife programs, because my career has been mostly made up of filming these big charismatic species, the type of animals that everybody recognizes, whether it's gorillas or elephants or lions and tigers. But it's all the kind of the smaller things that are part of that, really as important a part of the ecosystem as it's sort of the big iconic species. It's, I suppose, from a filmmaking point of view, it's difficult to get a commissioner on board. I want to make a documentary about plants, or British plants. Sort of, it's hard to kind of make the commissioner's ears prick up, where she said it's about wildcats, or about the reintroduction of lynx, or it's about snow leopards. So it's sort of, I think, for example, there was a friend of mine during lockdown. He wanted to he was in his sort of at home, and he thought, I'm going to go out and film some bees. And he filmed sort of macro photography of bees, slow motion. And he said, I'm going to see if I can get a program about bees, commission the bees in my garden. And he went to the commissioner, and they were like, no, not interested, not remotely interested. And he was like, well, I'm going to make it anyway. So he had all the equipment, and he started putting this film together. And then when he sent a kind of rough cut of this documentary made to the commissioner, and then suddenly they saw it and realized how fascinating these, this person's garden was and how fascinating these insects were. And that program has gone on to win really prestigious awards. So I think, yeah, you just have to tell those stories in the right way, and show how remarkable and how special those species are, whether it's a big mammal, whether it's a plant, whether it's an insect.
That doesn't surprise me at all, Gordon. In my experience, people definitely have a thing about bees, that's for sure. But Gordon, I know you attended COP26, the UN Climate Summit that happened in Glasgow just a couple of years ago. And I saw you talk also on social media about COP15, the UN Biodiversity Summit that happened in Montreal last December. Tell us a bit more. What was it like having COP26 in your part of the world and hosted in Glasgow, this huge international United Nations climate summit in Glasgow? What was that like?
Well, do you know, I sort of, as soon as I knew that COP was going to be in Glasgow, I was telling people that this was a big event, but so many people didn't know what COP was, what I was talking about. And I thought, gosh, what's this going to be like if the majority of people don't realize how important this is, and how significant it is to have it here in the UK. But I loved the fact that during COP in Glasgow, people were really fired up. There was people of all ages, from all backgrounds, sort of, that were playing a part, whether it was sort of marching, whether it was having a presence down at the hub. And you realize that actually these are kind of people that are coming together with that shared passion for not just for nature, but for the future of our planet. And nature isn't at the heart of politics, and it really should be. I was asked actually just before COP to be on a council put together by the First Minister of Scotland. So they got people from lots of different walks of life to sort of form this council that would help advise the Scottish government, irrespective of who is in power. It's sort of set up for 11 years to kind of help the Scottish government communicate to the population that nature is really important. It doesn't matter what your politics are, but if you've got a party, a sort of system of government that's saying, okay, this is important. This is it's not about us being in power and staying in power. It's about actually, communicating the importance of sustainability and nature to the population. And that's sort of, that's really encouraging. It's very slow progress, sort of anything that goes through government. So that's 2 years that the council's been set up, and we're still talking about how to communicate these things, still sort of making suggestions. So it's not it's not like a Marvel movie that you get all these sort of people with sort of varying degrees of expertise and knowledge around the world to come in and solve the problems. It's quite, it's frustratingly slow, but it's good to have a kind of seat at that table and sort of use the knowledge and experience that I have around the world to kind of try and help, in a Scottish context.
Yes, and we at the Wildlife Trust, we absolutely believe really strongly in that as well. We've got a lot of work planned over the next few years on trying to strengthen the youth voice in these kind of conversations. And so final question really for me, Gordon, particularly with young people in mind, how optimistic are you about the future?
There will be more loss before, we turn things round. But I think the hope that I do have for the future really comes from young people and how engaged and informed they are, compared to sort of when I started out, when I was 17, before I went off to Sierra Leone. You just wasn't aware of how vulnerable the world seemed to be, have enough wild places, enough wild animals. And what I've seen across my career, that sort of, the world is getting smaller. There's no such thing really as a vast wilderness. Wilderness is a place that is completely untouched by, humanity, and there isn't a 1 square meter on the planet that isn't affected by our presence on the planet. So with climate change and biodiversity loss, sort of pole to pole, we human beings are affecting the planet and everything that lives on it. So for young people that are engaged and informed, and sadly have grown up with this sort of fear for the future and fear for the future of the planet, hopefully they'll be the generation that can turn things around.
Yeah, it's very painful. It's very slow at times, but we're starting to see some things move in the right direction. And just this week, that agreement of a new global treaty to try and protect 30% of the high seas. And there's a long way to go yet. My goodness, there's a long way to go before we kind of make it happen. But I mean, actually, these are things that just a few years ago we could only dream of possible. So we're slowly but surely starting to see some things moving in the right direction. We just got to speed up a bit, I think.
Yeah, I think that is it. And I think we don't, sort of, most people don't realize how pressing these things are. All of the things that we should be doing now, we should have done 20 years ago.
Exactly.
And it's about, it's a kind of communications issue, really, to sort of, there's obviously so many people in the UK that are, that love nature and are aware of what's happening to wildlife and wild places here in the UK and around the world. But I think, for each and every one of us, the majority of people aren't aware of the impact that they as an individual have on the planet. And I think that's sort of, for the planet to have hope, we all have to sort of live our lives knowing that we impact negatively on nature, and we do everything we can to sort of limit that, limit the impact, hopefully till we get to a point where, we can be truly sustainable and we can have these circular economies that we can restore, threatened habitats and sort of bring back species from sort of the brink of extinction. So that's the sort of, I do think that's achievable. I don't know whether that's overly optimistic of me, but I think that we have it in our power. Young people certainly have the ability and the knowledge and the desire to work towards a sustainable future.
Absolutely. Well, Gordon, thank you so much for your time, for what's been a fascinating, brilliant conversation, and we really would love to welcome you to one of our reserves on your travels around the UK on your tour. Gordon, thank you also for giving us a pair of tickets to give away for various shows as part of the upcoming tour. And if you haven't entered yet, it's free. You just need to head over to our website, wildlifetrust.org, or have a look at our social media, and the competition ends on Friday. So do take part, and you might be lucky enough to win some tickets for Gordon's tour. And if you're not lucky enough to win, but want to hear more from Gordon about his fascinating career, then do head over to his website, Gordon Buchanan's website, where you can find links to all the upcoming tour days. And of course, if you've enjoyed the conversation today and want to keep in touch with us here at the Wildlife Trust, please hit follow, like or subscribe, depending on what you're watching this on. And we promise to bring you lots more content over the coming weeks. But Gordon, good luck with the tour. It sounds like it's going to be fantastic. Great conversations for people that come along to it. Thank you so much for this conversation now, and best of luck with it.
It's a total pleasure. Thank you so much, Craig. That's great.
Sea eagles.
Okay.
They need their story to be told, and I'm the one with the camera.
That's great.
This is a place that is wild beyond belief.